The world is witnessing a seismic shift. The United States, once the bedrock of European security, has frozen military aid to Ukraine, now officially. And it sends shockwaves through Kyiv, Brussels, London, Paris, and beyond. Timothy Ash, an expert in European security and a guest at our wrap-up episodes, has called it a staggering, extraordinary, and on the scale of the Soviet Union's collapse. And he might not be wrong. With President Trump's pivot toward Moscow, NATO's reliability is now under serious question, and the European leaders are scrambling to fill in this security void led by Washington now. So what does this mean for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the global balance of power at all? This is Pavlo Shtelmach for the Daily Wrap-Up. Let's go. First, for Ukraine, this decision is nothing short of an existential threat. US aid has been the backbone of Ukraine's military for many years, and the ability to resist Russian aggression. With that support now in turmoil and limbo, Kyiv faces the very risk of running low on ammunition, air defense missiles for Patriots, which is really important, and intelligence data, which allows Ukraine to strike deep into the Russian frontline bases and even rear. And heavy weaponry at a critical time on the battlefield might run low too. Let's be clear, the fight for Ukraine's survival has never been easy, and it has never been just about Ukraine. It's about the security of Europe, the strength of the NATO alliance, and the future of the global order at all. If US aid remains frozen for a long time, it could accelerate Russian advances on the front line, push Ukraine's military back, and force Kyiv into negotiations on Moscow's terms, which basically mean capitulation. Their demands, so-called denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, are nothing new and nothing more than calls for regime change and permanent subjugation. They are preparing for total victory right now. But despite the setbacks, Ukraine is still standing, and Europe may finally be realizing that its security depends on Ukraine's survival now. As of now, all military aid flow to Ukraine is frozen from the US, and even intelligence data are in question. These data are crucial for Ukrainians to strike Russian headquarters and bases all over the front and in the rear, which is really important. And for decades, Europe has depended on the United States for security. NATO. It is an alliance led by Washington. It has been the ultimate guarantee of protection, but that dynamic is shifting. With Trump openly questioning US commitments, European leaders are being forced to reconsider their long-term defense strategies already at this moment. Is this good news? Some European nations are stepping up. And a recent poll in France shows that 2/3 of French citizens support either manufacturing, maintaining, or increasing assistance to Ukraine. French President Macron has also floated the idea of sending European peacekeepers to Ukraine once hostilities end. But will that be enough? Europe still faces a massive challenge in closing the military gap left by America's potential withdrawal. Years of underinvestment have left European arsenals depleted. Even though leaders in Berlin, Paris, and London are ramping up defense spending now, military rebuilding stockpiles and manufacturing enough weapons to replace US will take years, if not decades. In the meantime, Ukraine needs immediate support. The coming months will test whether European powers can mobilize fast enough to prevent a disaster on their doorstep, and European leaders seem to understand the entire urgency of the security situation. All eyes are on France and the UK now, but never can we count out Germany, and their winning parties in the election have recently developed a common ground on rebuilding and reinvesting in the military infrastructure of the country. And Trump's decision doesn't just affect Ukraine, it is redefining the global balance of powers. For decades, the transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe has been an unbreakable one, but now the alliance is cracking on our eyes. The new security treaty is not on the horizon right now, and if Washington continues down this path, Europe may be forced to seek new partners, perhaps even looking toward China or the Gulf states to secure its interests in the future. There's also the long-term question of NATO itself. If the US effectively abandons its role as the leader of the alliance, does NATO even survive in its current form? Or does Europe create its own security bloc, its own Euro-NATO, independent of American leadership and involvement? What's certain is that Russia is benefiting from this crisis at this moment. Moscow now sees an opportunity to push its advantage forward, not just in Ukraine but across Europe. And if Ukraine is left to fight alone, Russia will not stop here. Let's be clear, a Ukrainian defeat wouldn't just be a disaster for Kyiv, it would send shockwaves throughout Europe and, in the end, most certainly lead to World War III. It would embolden other authoritarian regimes worldwide and unite them, and it would shatter the credibility of Western security guarantees. It could trigger a massive wave of Ukrainian refugees fleeing westwards and create social and political turmoil across the remaining EU states. We've seen what happens when aggressors are appeased. We've seen that in 1938 in Munich. History has taught up this lesson before, and right now we are at a critical moment where the decisions made in Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv will determine the future of this war and the continent. Despite the uncertainty, one thing is clear: Ukraine still has friends and allies out there. Across Europe, support for Ukraine remains strong, and it is even stronger right now after all this turmoil in the Oval Office and United States seeming refusal to continue investing into NATO. The question is, will those allies step up in time? Ukraine's survival depends on more than just weapons. It depends on global unity, transatlantic unity, strategic leadership, and the willingness to defend democracy against dictatorship. It is the common way of living here in Europe and in America for many, many decades. And the coming weeks will be really decisive. As always, Ukraine's fight is our all fight. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and support us to help deliver the news of the free world directly to you from Ukraine. Stay safe and don't let propaganda win. So hello everyone, today in the UATV studio Mr. Edward Lucas is the guest. Greetings. Yes, thank you for coming. And to start with, let's discuss what is really going on with the US policy toward Russia right now, particularly during Trump's second presidency, and the impact on European and NATO security after this inauguration and the new policy shift?
I think it's important to stay away from the details of the tantrums and micro dramas of who said what to whom in the Oval Office and who's signed what piece of paper about some mythical minerals deal. The big picture is what matters, and it is clear to me that President Trump wants to be friends with Putin's Kremlin, and he's willing to do that at the expense of European security. And that is a complete game changer. That is something we have not seen since the foundation of the Atlantic Alliance back in the Second World War, and it poses enormous questions for Europe. It imposes enormous costs on us, and particularly, I'm afraid, on Ukraine. In the long run, it poses costs on America as well, but I'm afraid that by the time the Americans realize what they have done, a great deal of damage will have already been done. Yes, I think that the Trump administration is composed of many different strands of thought and factions, and there are some people who just say, like Rick in the movie Casablanca, the problems of the world are not my department, and we want to focus solely on fixing America. And that's one strand. There's another strand, which one might call the Neo-Kissinger strand, which says we face an existential struggle with China, and China is the only thing that matters. And if we have to make big sacrifices in Europe or get out of Africa or even abandon American involvement in the Middle East, that's fine, because we just have to husband. We need every piece of artillery, every satellite, every brain, every atom focused on the threat from China. And I fear that that provides an excuse for giving Russia a free hand, either in Eastern Europe or in all of Europe. But the cake is not quite baked yet, and it's possible we will see rapid turnarounds, and it may be that some of our worst fears aren't realized, but the trust is gone. We cannot trust America, having done this appalling series of missteps once. We will not be able to rely on America for many years to come.
Yes, I usually remember the movie Darkest Hour about Churchill and the phrase that darkest time is usually before dawn. And what is happening right now? We are seeing Europe being unified, even after UK Brexit. So United Kingdom left the European Union. But in fact, in the defense sector, in some common senses and values, they are still part of the same side, the same alliance. We've heard that President Macron and Keir Starmer can go to Washington together with Volodymyr Zelensky right now. And this leads to another question. What is Europe's stance on negotiations with Russia, and how the Americans, they influence these discussions now? Because we have Ukrainian position, only reliable peace, and peace on some maybe consensus, not on Russian terms. We have American model right now, peace at any cost, peace right now in Europe, because they want obviously to shift the attention to the Pacific, probably. That is my guess. And what is Europe's take on these negotiations? What is their interest?
Well, Europe's first interest is survival. And this is not just a question of closing the defense gap, with America making an orderly, polite withdrawal from Europe. That would be bad enough. We now face the possibility that Europe is actually dealing with two adversaries, one in Moscow and one in Washington. And we don't know if our advanced American weapons will work. If we are countries that have the F-35 warplane or the JASSM missile, these are heavily software dependent. Suppose we face a fight with Russia in the Baltic area or in the Arctic or wherever, and the United States says we do not want these weapons, these American-made weapons, used in some border skirmish with Russia. So we've got some very difficult times ahead of us. I think we're going to have 5 to 10 years of great risks and great costs, and with the prospect of success at the end, but plenty can go wrong in the meantime. And the most important thing for Europe at the moment is not so much getting weapons production going, though we need to do that, and I'm personally working on that right now with my new plan for a defense bank. The most important thing is political will, because if the Kremlin, and for that matter, if the White House, look at Europe and they see a united, cohesive, decisive team who are willing to accept risk and make sacrifices in order to achieve goals, then Europe is much more secure, because Europe potentially is very strong. 500 million people, 17 trillion GDP. Europe could be a very strong force in regional and world politics, with a decisive say in what happens. But if Europe remains fragmented, then bigger countries will just push the European countries around, and then we face a very bleak future indeed.
So you're telling me that not the production dependence, but actually the technology production is the real case here. I've remembered some cases when licenses of Switzerland were banned for Ukraine, for Gepard air defense complexes as well, because they were produced jointly with Switzerland, and for a long time Germany couldn't have supplied that to Ukraine. And with American weapons, is it possible that they say, no, we ban you from using our weapons that you have bought from us, that you have waited for 10, 15 years to deliver, and which is really essential, maybe in the fight with Russia. And then in one moment they say, no, you can't use those weapons because we will not trade with you, for example.
Well, and that's exactly what I said. And I mean, in retrospect, the French decision to go for a tightly integrated, vertically integrated supply chain, which seemed very eccentric at the time, now looks very, very prescient and wise. And we will be going through all our weapon systems, working out, is there an opportunity for American sabotage, just as previously we had gone through looking for an opportunity of Chinese sabotage. And so this means we're not starting from scratch in Europe, we're starting from minus scratch. And we have to think very hard about what we have that will actually work and how we can stick that together into some kind of deterrent. Now, it's not just the weapons, they are very important. We have the financial deterrent because we can seize the 300 billion. We've already seized, we've frozen the 300 billion in Russian assets. We could, I mean, I would seize them at once, but we could also say if you break any ceasefire in Ukraine, then we seize them. And we have offensive cyber capabilities with some very advanced countries with cyber espionage and cyber warfare capabilities. Though again, we worry now, how much do the Americans know about what we've got, and would they tip the Russians off, and so that these weapons wouldn't work? But this is a completely new era. We are back now to the pre-First World War era, where America sat glowering on the far side of the Atlantic, disliking European countries for their arrogance and imperial habits, not wanting to pick sides in continental disputes, and trying to pursue its own interests, mainly in the Western Hemisphere. And this is an era that nobody alive today remembers, and we have a very short amount of time to get used to it before it will be too late to do anything. So, I mean, I think there's still a chance that we can keep the United States at least neutral. And I think that the pressure from the markets, the bond markets, the stock markets, and from big American defense manufacturers will say, hey, you're trashing our export markets with your policy. Yes. So I don't think that, as I said, the cake isn't baked yet. And we may, if we're lucky, we'll end up with a neutral America. And we will then find it easier to deal with our problems with Russia. But it's possible we get a hostile America. And that is which is effectively treating us as a bargaining counter. When I say us, I mean you, Ukraine, and us in Britain and everybody else. And we are something that they're going to give to Russia in the hope of getting Putin's support against China. And this is, if that happens, is going to make it even more difficult. But today is Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent. And I think we have 40 days for penitence about our past mistakes, resolve to start doing things that we haven't done, and to stop doing things that are bad for us. And I hope that by the time we get to Easter, we will Europe will be in a stronger state. But we are really, I think we have only weeks to get our act together. And I'm encouraged by the progress so far, but it is still not nearly enough.